Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And as usually the most important and the most interesting updates are coming from Orekhov bridgehead. The Ukrainians during the previous night of the local time made another few attempts to penetrate the Russians' defense orders. The Russians reported that all those attacks were repelled, and the Ukrainians, having very heavy losses, were forced to step back. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous night attacks, the Ukrainians lost 300 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles, including 4 Leopard tanks, 11 fighting infantry machines, including 5 Bradleys, and 4 fighting armored vehicles, and 6 light vehicles, and 1 artillery system Caesar. The first attacks the Ukrainians made in the vicinity of small settlement Lapkovo. Probably the Ukrainians were trying to capture this settlement because this settlement was since the beginning of this counter-offensive operation in the gray zone, and the Russians published another video of Ukrainian attempts to capture this settlement and to establish their positions. As you can see, the first in the head of convoy was a tank, and after the tank the squad of soldiers were moving, and as soon as the Russians spotted and discovered those troops, they started bombing and shelling this territory heavily. We don't have any numbers or any results of at least that attack, but probably because the fact that the Russians managed to spot those forces, most of them were destroyed, and probably the Ukrainians were forced to step back from this settlement. Anyway, for now, small settlement Lapkovo still remains in the gray zone, and probably the Ukrainians will make few more attempts to capture the settlement in the next few days. Now let's talk about Orekhov, because today we got a lot of very interesting updates. Before we start discussing the videos and the tactics that the Ukrainians were using and the Russians were using on this area, interesting update is coming from the global scope of this front line. The Ukrainians are saying that after the Russians managed to defeat the 37th, 47th and 33rd brigades, 23rd brigades on this front line, the Ukrainians took a decision to move the 21st and 22nd brigades to this area, and those two brigades are also a part of strategical Ukrainian reserves. Those brigades, based on the deployment maps, were located in the vicinity of Nikolaev, 22nd and 21st brigade, so let's move them on this front line. As you can see, the Ukrainians, at least according to this piece of news, are not going to stop. They will continue pressing, they will continue attacking exactly in this direction, or probably they will move a little bit to the west, or a little bit, I don't think that they're going to move to the east because we see the level of fortifications, but probably they will try to attack or develop their bridgehead at least in the vicinity of Gulay-Polye, because we know that Ukrainians, there are like 10 days left before the NATO summit, and they need to show at least something. They need to show at least one settlement that can be captured during this counter-offensive operation, but for now the Ukrainians can't even capture forest or brushes or fields under the open air or something like this. So the Ministry of Defense reported that the Ukrainians during the previous day tried and made few attempts to attack at least in direction of small settlement Novopokrovka. That attack, according to the Russian sources, was repelled by the Russian forces, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. Furthermore, during the attack, probably the first forces managed to get the outskirts of these fortifications. They started bombing and shelling this settlement with artillery, with the tanks and so on. And at some point of that operation, the Ukrainians asked for help to send more reserves, and the Ukrainians sent at least 2 convoys, and those convoys were discovered and spotted by the Russians, and those convoys were destroyed by the Russian forces. And today the Ministry of Defense published another video how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian convoys using the drones. And this video you can see how one drone destroyed the first track, then the second drone fled the same direction but attacked the second track in the same line, and the third drone destroyed the final track in this small group of Ukrainian forces. Probably, as you can see on the left side, there are more vehicles, and probably those vehicles were also destroyed by the Russian drones and so on. So as you can see, the Ukrainians were losing their forces that couldn't even get the combat line, and they were destroyed just on march during the movements on the ground, and probably even on the territory that were controlled by the Ukrainian forces. Another interesting video the Russians published, how they were destroying the Ukrainian Leopards using the drones. As you can see on this video, one Leopard were trying to hide along the forest line, but the Leopard was discovered by the drone, by the Russian forces, and after that, that tank was destroyed. So the Ukrainians lost a lot of forces, and as you can see, mainly most of those drones were flying above the gray zone or the territory that were the territory that was under Ukrainian control. So basically we see, and we haven't seen any video or photo confirmation from the Ukrainian side how they were attacking the Russian forces on their side using their own drones. So probably somehow the Russians managed to find a solution how to suppress the Ukrainian signals, their radio, their connections, and the Ukrainians just basically couldn't use their drone forces to attack the Russian forces. From the other side, the Russians managed to find the key how to create a stable connection and stable connection line between Russian forces and drone forces above the territory of Novodanilovka and Orekhov, and that helped the Russians to destroy most of the Ukrainian forces that were heading to the combat line. As we discussed, as we talked many times, the Ukrainians during the previous days couldn't capture even the first line of defense. Furthermore, today the Russian military experts made a lot of analysis these days. A lot of experts are doing a lot of analysis about the situation, and I read most of them. And today I read very interesting analysis saying that the Russians started using very interesting tactics on this Orekhov front line, and that they started using new type of weapon, and this is the type of weapon I'm talking about. This is the distance mining system agriculture. It's like their title, agriculture. This system, as you can see, have at least 25 missiles that have I couldn't find the number of mines that this every single missile has, but probably they are able to, during one launch, are able to send at least probably 100 mines or something like this. So the Russians were using the following tactics, and that was very interesting to understand. Let's assume that this is Ukrainian forces who managed to collect their forces somewhere in the south of Danilovka. They managed to build attack orders, and let's assume that these forces took a decision to attack along fields to the south on the Russian mining fields. And the thing is that they started their movement, and they're moving very slow because the first vehicle in this convoy always was after the tanks that were equipped and upgraded with the demining equipment. And this demining equipment is very, very heavy. So that's why the first tank goes very, very slowly. So that's why the entire convoy, entire column goes very, very slowly. And these forces are moving to the south. And the Russians were not attacking these, probably they were attacking, but that was not the main thing that the Russians were trying to do. Anyway, all these fields on the south of these tanks were mined since the beginning of this offensive counter-offensive operation. And sooner or later, at some point of this travel, this convoy entered the mining field. And of course, the first mines started destroying, started blowing. And the Russians were saying that after the Ukrainians entered this or that mining field, it took around 60 till 90 minutes before the first tank equipped with the demining equipment was destroyed on that minefields. And as soon as this main tank was destroyed, of course, there is no reason to continue that offensive operation, and the Ukrainians took a decision to start moving back, let's say for regrouping, because some forces during some period of time, those forces were under artillery attack. Probably they got some losses. The losses weren't critical, so it's good to return back for regrouping. Let's say to get another let's say demining tank, and to start everything from the very beginning. And now the time of new Russian mining system agriculture came. What the Russians were doing. As soon as the Ukrainians started moving to the south, we discussed they were moving very slowly. The Russians started first mine the area behind those forces, not in front of them, but behind, because it's a minefield, and when you enter a field, if you were able to demine some part of the territory, of course, it is safer to use the same way to evacuate from this territory. So the Russians, of course, using drone forces, they were able to see the road that Ukrainians were used to enter the south, and of course they started mining exactly the territory behind those forces. And when the Ukrainians turned back, usually during those days they entered the new minefields that were recently created by the Russians. And of course that situation led to more losses from the Ukrainian side, and during, let's say, just this circle, the Ukrainians were losing up to 15-20% of their forces. Okay, but this is not the end of the story. All those running along the minefields led to significant losses, and the Ukrainians were forced to stand a little bit somewhere in the vicinity of Novodanilovka for regrouping, for replacements, and so on. And usually that situation took around 2-3 hours. Meanwhile, the Russians started mining process of the minefields that the Ukrainians entered at first, and basically they just refreshed the minefields in front of those forces. And basically when the Ukrainians, after regrouping, after 2 hours, they started another attempt to attack, and they thought that they were entering completely the fields that were already demined. At least some part of those fields were demined by the Ukrainians during the previous attempt, but basically they entered completely new field that was refreshed with mines, and the story began for every time from the beginning. They got the minefields, they lost their main demined equipment, they were forced to return back. Meanwhile, the Russians have already refreshed the mines behind them, and they entered the minefields one more time. So it's like basic explanation that I'm trying to show you, but usually this is exactly what did happen on this front line, and why the Ukrainians couldn't reach even the first line of defense, because we haven't seen any updates that the Ukrainians were able to get the first defense line, because every time the Russians were refreshing the minefields all the time, and the Ukrainians all the time when they started attack, they were forced to start everything from the beginning. So that was the hell that Ukrainians were forced to deal with during the previous 6 or 7 days on Orechov, Vremivka tactical bridgeheads. Now let's go to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, and the Russians reported that they managed to repulse the Ukrainian attacks in direction of small settlement Livadne. The Russians managed to repulse the Ukrainian attack in direction of northern settlements like Niskuchne and Storozhovo. All those attacks were repelled, and the Ukrainians, according to some sources, were able to capture some hills, but currently, as I understand, those hills are still in the gray zone, and the Russians continue counteroffensive, trying to restore control over those hills. Now we are going to Donetsk, to Marinka and Avdiivka areas. We haven't received any updates. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation haven't provided us also no information about the clashes in this area, about the losses and so on. And the Russians mainly were concentrated by talking and discussing the situation in the vicinity of Bakhmut or Artyomovsk, because the Ukrainians started counteroffensive. They continued their counteroffensive operation in this area, and some sources are saying that as a result of fierce fightings and storming operations of probably 77th or 57th or probably 67th brigades in this area, they managed to capture some area in the vicinity of Yahidne. Some sources are saying that they managed to capture these fields right in front of Yahidne. Now, the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, they managed to repel those attacks in direction of Yahidne. Also, the Russians reported that they repelled attacks in direction of Dubovo-Vasilievka, probably with 56 motorized brigade. Also, the Russians repelled all attacks in direction of Klishevka from Ivanovska. Probably the Ukrainians were using forces of 5th and 3rd brigades, and the Russians repelled attacks in direction of Andreevka, probably of 24th of attack of 24th mechanized brigade. Also, the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians took a decision to continue a counter-offensive operation in Bakhmut, and for these purposes they took a decision to send newly created 38th Brigade from strategical reserves. So let's find 38th Brigade, just a second. 38th Marine Brigade, this one. Yes, as we can see, this brigade, Marine Brigade, is located in the vicinity of Odessa. So I thought that they will try to use Marine Brigades somewhere in the Zaporozhye area, but as you can see, currently the Ukrainians took a decision, at least to some sources, to bring this brigade, fresh brigade, to Bakhmut, and this brigade has a lot of Western weapon on board, so probably they will try to change the picture and they will try to continue advancing in the vicinity of Bakhmut. The Russian sources published the video of another attempt of Ukrainian forces to storm these areas. You can see the Ukrainians sent tanks, probably Tu-72 or probably T-64, but as you can see, the Russians are trying to bomb and shelling this area heavily and trying to get these tanks using artillery or some parts. And as you can see in this video, as a result of one of those storms, the Ukraine lost at least 2 tanks in the vicinity of Artyomovsk as a result of artillery fire or as a result of drone attack. For example, in this video you see how the Ukrainians are trying to get on board of one of armored vehicles, and then the Russians destroy that armored vehicles. So some sources were saying that Ukrainians, as a result of fightings in this area during the previous days, previous week, probably lost around 2005 soldiers. We haven't seen these numbers from the Ministry of Defense, but this is the numbers that the local soldiers, the local sources on the ground provided us as a result of those attempts from the Ukrainian side. When talking about the northern part, about Seversk bridgehead, probably both sides took a small operational pause, but the Russians slowly but are trying to restore the activity in this area. Today they destroyed the headquarters of 10th Brigade that currently located in the vicinity of Razdolovka, Veselaya, Spornaya. This is their area of responsibilities, and the Russians started, or not started, but continue advancing in Kremenaya forest, and today they shown us another video how they were using the the Russians has distance mining systems, and also the Russians has distance demining systems. So currently on this video you see the work of distance demining systems. The Russians using these systems are trying to create a safe road for the soldiers. This road is not very wide, just a small trap, small not very wide road, but anyway it's better than nothing because it's a forest. There are a lot of traps, a lot of mines, a lot of difficult places, and currently you can see how this system works, and as a result of usage of that system, you see the Russians managed to destroy probably some minefields or something like this. So anyway, we see that the Russians started another activity and probably started intensifying actions on this side, and probably within the next few days we're going to see more advances to the south in direction of Seversky Donetsk River, because as we discussed, the Russians need to capture Seversk to maintain the bridgehead and to get and to start anyway the operation of Slaviansk-Kramatorsk battle. When talking about Kupiansk-Liman front line, from interesting updates, we see that the Russians destroyed the ammo depot of 66th Brigade, and that's it, nothing more. The Ministry of Defense reported that Ukrainians lost 125 soldiers on Kupiansk-Liman front line, 9 armored vehicles. By the way, when talking about Bakhmut, when talking about the previous 24 hours, Artyomovsk, the Ukrainians lost 230 soldiers. As you can see, the level of losses is still very high, but the level is lower in comparison with Zaporozhye area. And the final bridgehead we have missed is the Kherson area. There are no changes on the ground. The water goes from the southern part. Probably you've seen the video and photo of the Dnipro reservoir in the vicinity of Energodar. In the next video, in the morning video, I will show you the difference between the level of water now and before, and we'll see whether the Ukrainians are going to do anything in this area. Another interesting update is that after visiting Kherson, if you remember, recently Zelensky was in Kherson, he went back, and now currently he's in Kiev. And today with an unannounced visit, the Prime Minister of Canada Justin Trudeau visited Kiev. He had meetings and he had a lot of meetings with Zelensky. They were talking a lot. Probably there are a lot of topics to discuss. Of course, the first one, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Justin Trudeau and Zelensky were talking about the F-16, and probably Canada is going to be one of the first vendors who is going to provide Ukraine with these systems. From the other side, another thing that those people were discussing is like a failed attempt to counter-offensive in the south, and probably Justin Trudeau brought some message to Zelensky about equipment, about armored vehicles, or about further plans, or so on. Anyway, I believe that within the next few days we're going to see and understand everything. Very interesting updates we received from the Russian intelligence. If you remember, during the previous days there were a lot of fierce fightings in Shebekino, and according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians made one of the biggest mistakes from the beginning of the special military operation. And I'm talking about the forces of Free Russian Regiment of Russian Democratic Republic. If you remember, the Ukrainians, these forces of Russian Democratic Republic are controlled by the Ukrainian intelligence, and the thing is that the Ukrainians created a proxy Russian army to attack the territory of Russian Federation. And currently the Russians and Russian authorities discuss the same operation in Moscow, the same operation to create proxy Ukrainian forces and to start the same action but in Chernihiv and Sumy region. So to create proxy Ukrainian army with Ukrainian flag saying that we are not the enemy, we are not against the Ukrainians, we are against the Zelensky and his people in Kiev, and we want to force these people to go away from Ukraine and to restore good relations with Russians under Ukrainian flag. So this is the situation, and that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.